Gramma by synthetic_tinsel. I thought something might have been wrong with Grandma. I thought she might have been sick, but every time I asked her if she's okay, she just smiled and politely said, "Never mind me." My brother, Tommy, and I had lived with her for about 9 years. We moved in when Mom and Dad died in 2011. It was a car crash, but I prefer not to think about it. It was a rough time for the both of us. I was 7 and Tommy was 5 when Grandma and Grandpa took us in, and other than the fact that my brother and I have to share a room, things had been nice. Grandpa died about 3 years ago. Heart attack. Although you would never guess so when looking at his old photos, Grandpa was a heavier man in his later years. Grandma always scolded him for eating too much, but she fed him plenty nonetheless. Grandma had always been thin, judging by her old pictures at least. And all the time I'd known her, she's always eaten very little, always only putting small portions on her plate. Small portions mean a small figure, she was fond of saying. She began eating more after Grandpa died. At first, I thought it was just because she didn't want to waste the food. She still made the same amount of food as she did when she had one more mouth to feed. I originally assumed that it was just out of habit. Tommy and I could eat, but we definitely couldn't finish off Grandma's big meals. A year after Grandpa's death, she still did this. Every night, feasts covered the table, surely too much for just 3 people. Yet every night, not a drop went to waste. Grandma still had her flagpole figure, but she sure didn't eat like it. But she didn't just eat, she devoured. One day I caught her greedily shoving her food in her mouth, her bare hands violently snatching at her plate. Bits of gravy poured through the slits of her fingers like a muddy waterfall. She caught Tommy and I staring, so she froze, gave each of us a cold and piercing stare, and just smiled. When she did, a string of meat rolled out of her mouth and slapped her chin. And this wasn't the only thing that Tommy and I had noticed. Grandma's hair seemed to have been falling out in great big chunks, leaving large bald spots on her pale scalp. Her teeth, too. Grandma had always been very diligent about brushing her teeth. When we were younger, she would stand over my brother and I as we brushed our teeth to make sure we were being thorough. But currently, she seemed to be neglecting her own oral care. Her teeth were mostly black and chipped, and every once in a while, I would find a tooth or two in the sink. Tommy was the more concerned of the two of us. Even though Grandma and I had always been close, she and Tommy had always shared a tighter bond. I think it was because he's the baby of the family. He had tried multiple times to get her to go to the doctor, but she always refused with a wave of the hand. "Oh, stop worrying about me," she'd say. "Never mind me, I'm just getting old." So, aside from her new looks, which were increasingly harder to look at, Tommy and I just started minding our own business. That is, until the night that I got up in the middle of the night to pee and witnessed something strange. As I was walking past the stairs, I could hear mumbling and the creaking of the house's old wooden floors. I saw Grandma walking out of the kitchen and into the living room, passing the foot of the stairs in the process. She was naked and mumbling to herself. I tried to listen, but I couldn't hear what she was saying. "Grandma," I called out in a loud whisper. "Grandma, is everything okay?" She stopped at the foot of the stairs, stared up at me, and smiled. Her eyes seemed to have that weird glow to them that a cat's eyes have in the dark. Without saying a word and without breaking eye contact, she began dry heaving, then projectile vomiting all over the stairs. The sound of the retching made the hair on the back of my neck stick straight up, and goosebumps covered my arms. A small dribble of vomit ran down in between her breasts, leaving a brownish trail behind it. She stared at me for what felt like an eternity. I let out a small gasp. "Grandma?" The words felt coarse coming out of my dry mouth. Grandma responded with a snicker and quickly shuffled out of sight. I could hear the swishing noise her bare feet made on the wooden floor. I probably should have followed her, to make sure everything was okay, but to be honest, I was really freaked out by the whole thing. so I ran back to my room and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, before we left our bedroom, I had told Tommy what I had seen. "Just like that? Puked all over the stairs and didn't say a word?" Tommy asked, with a hint of disbelief in his tone. "Yeah, dude, I promise," I replied. "I wouldn't lie about something like that." "And you didn't check on her to see if she was okay, or even bother to wake me up?" "No, I was scared, Tommy. Everything about the situation was odd. And I guess I just freaked." Tommy let out an exasperated sigh. "Wuss?" he said. "Shut up," I replied. "Come on, I'll show you." The two of us walked down the hallway without saying a word. We reached the top of the stairs. I pointed down to the bottom of the steps. That's where she was standing. We walked down, being careful to watch where we stepped, neither one of us wanting to risk stepping and vomit. The stairs were clean. Not a drop of evidence of last night's horrors. There wasn't even the smell that vomit so often leaves in its wake, nor was there the smell of cleaning materials. It's like it hadn't even happened. "See, I knew that sounded like bullshit. You probably just imagined it or had a bad dream or something." Tommy poked fun at me. "Boys, get in here. Breakfast is ready," Grandma shouted from the kitchen. "Not a word about any of this," I told Tommy. "Understand?" Tommy nodded his head without saying a word. In the kitchen, the table was covered, as usual, with more food than the three of us could realistically eat. Well, at least before Grandma's voracious appetite, that is. Bacon, eggs, sausage, biscuits and gravy, pancakes, and orange juice littered the table. "So, about last night," Grandma said to me. "I hope I didn't scare you. Grandma just wasn't feeling well, that's all. Never mind me." She said this with a mouthful of food. Bits of biscuit shot out of her mouth every few words. As she spoke, I gave Tommy a little "I told you so" kick on the leg under the table. Yeah, I stuttered back to her. "Okay, well, I hope you're feeling better." She smiled that awful grin, but said nothing. I decided to drop the subject because, in all honesty, it really did scare me. Something about the way she shuffled her feet really got to me. The way her eyes unnaturally glowed in the dark. Just the strangeness of the whole thing had really thrown me. I told myself that I had been watching too many horror movies, that Grandma was just a little sick and off her game, that's all. That night, I had a lot of trouble sleeping. I just couldn't get the images of the previous night out of my head. I was even too afraid of getting up and going to the bathroom, so as gross as it sounds, I kept a pee bottle beside my bed. Around 3 a.m., I finally found myself drifting off to sleep. Tommy, weirdly unbothered by the whole situation, had been asleep since 10. He had always been the early to bed, early to rise type. Faintly, I could hear that quick shuffling sound downstairs. I could hear the retching, and my heart began to pound. Adrenaline pumping through my body, I was now wide awake, my senses so finely tuned that I could hear even the faintest of sounds. I took some deep breaths to calm myself down, and it worked for a while. About 20 minutes after I had heard the initial sounds, I could hear the sound of the stairs creaking under the weight that found itself upon them. "Oh God, oh God, oh God, she's coming up here," I whispered to myself. "Why is she coming up here?" The sound of dragging footsteps haunted me as they inched towards my bedroom door. The footsteps stopped. The world became deathly silent, and the only thing I could hear was a slight ringing in my ears. I could see the door handle slowly turn clockwise, and the door slid slightly open with a quiet squeak. A small patch of light shined through from the nightlight that was kept in the hallway, revealing the bony fingers that wrapped themselves around the inside of the door. "Tommy? Tommy?" I whispered, careful to not alert Grandma of my knowledge of her presence. "Tommy, wake up. Something weird is going on." Nothing but a small groan from him as he rolled from his side onto his back. The door opened a little wider now, and a foot stepped lightly into the room. I could hear a faint chuckle from behind the door. Inch by inch, Grandma slowly shimmied her way into our room. She dropped on all fours in a rapid movement and proceeded in a spider-like crawl to the foot of Tommy's bed. She lifted up his covers and slowly forced her way up. No longer able to hide my fear, I asked, "Grandma, what are you doing?" Other than a brief pause, she didn't seem to acknowledge my question. She continued to snake her way under the covers so that she was lying directly on top of Tommy, who was now awake and starting to ask his own questions. Pinned by her weight, Tommy was unable to move. Grandma was now face to face with him. I got out of the bed and shouted, "Grandma, enough! Get off of him!" In a rapid movement, she snapped her head to the side to look at me. "Shut your filthy mouth before I shut it for you, you little shit," she hissed at me. "Take one more step and you'll be seeing your parents tonight." Her eyes glowed just like they did the night before. She began to whisper into Tommy's right ear. As much as I tried to listen, I couldn't make out what she was saying. Tommy slowly nodded in affirmation every few seconds without saying a word. Grandma turned Tommy's head to face her own. Staring directly into his eyes, her mouth opened and her jaw unhinged with a snap, creating a large oval-shaped black hole. Her thin, greasy hair dangled over her face. With a pinch of her fingers, she forced Tommy's mouth open and spewed a thick black liquid into his mouth. All the while, he was violently seizing. After about 10 seconds, the last of the liquid drained out of Grandma's mouth and into Tommy's. Tommy stopped seizing, and Grandma slumped down on top of him. "Tommy?" I said with tears in my eyes. "Tommy, are you okay?" Without saying a word, he threw Grandma's flaccid body to the side like a piece of discarded trash and swung his feet over the edge of the bed. He stood up and stared at me. His eyes were glowing, just like Grandma's used to. "Tommy?" I asked. He smiled and slowly shook his head from side to side. I ran. I ran as fast as I could out the bedroom door, down the stairs, and down the street. I was so scared that any human interaction, real human interaction, would do. I knocked on 3 different doors before I finally got an answer. "Kid, what are you doing?" the man asked. "Do you have any idea what time it is? It's dangerous to knock on people's doors at this time of night. I could have mistaken you for a burglar and shot you, you know." Out of breath from running, I told him to call 911. "Call 911. Please. I'll explain. Just call." Looking up and down the street to make sure I was alone, the man said, "Okay, kid. Come in and get yourself calmed down." After a few minutes, I caught my breath and told him the story. I don't think he believed me, but he agreed to call the police nonetheless. The police arrived, and one pulled me aside. He asked me to tell the story in as best detail as possible, which I did. He also had a look of incredulity on his face, but he wrote it down anyway. An hour later, after the house had been cleared, I saw them bring Grandma out on a stretcher. She was in a black bag, but I knew it was her. A large man in a police uniform came up to me and the policeman I was recounting my story to. He told me to stay put while he pulled his partner aside. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I imagined they were discussing what I had said. The large cop came over to me and said, "We found your grandmother, but your brother is nowhere to be found. Do you have any idea where he could have gone?" "No, I'm sorry, I don't," I replied. "Okay," he said with a sigh. "Well, is there any other family that he could have gone with?" "No, not really. Our parents died 9 years ago, and our grandparents live 5 hours away." "We can't leave you here since you're a minor, so why don't you come down to the station with us while we get things figured out? We'll contact your other grandparents for you." I did, and they did. It's been a year since that happened. since I last saw Tommy. I've been living with my other grandparents, my dad's parents, in the meantime. We've never even gotten updates about him, although we did get some updates on Grandma. According to the autopsy, she had died of heart failure, although the coroner said that, judging by the deteriorated state of her organs, she should have been dead for almost a year. I don't know what happened to my brother, and I don't suppose I ever will. I just wanted to see if it would be cathartic to tell my story. I guess it was a little, but I would give anything to know what happened.